In this week's painting tutorial, I'm going to show you how to paint a study of a hand. And a study basically means a practice painting, one just for yourself, where you get to experiment with new techniques and slow down for a while. I'll go over some basic structural anatomy of the hand, and of course, I'm going to walk you through all the techniques that I use to paint this one. And that's the things that you're seeing on the screen right now, like skin textures, wrinkles, and using shadows and highlights to form the structures underneath the skin. Now, I chose to paint a hand for this tutorial because it's difficult. Hands are some of the trickiest things to paint, but I did my best to simplify a lot of things in this one so that's not overwhelming. And I know that it's definitely not the most exciting subjects to paint, but it's definitely a fun one to work on. And what makes it fun to me is all the textures, the subtle and the not so subtle textures that we have to paint. So if you're going to be copying this one and painting along with me, up on the screen right now is a photo of my completed painting. You could use this as your reference. And this video is in high resolution. It's filmed in 4K. So if you take a screenshot, you should have plenty of resolution to work from. And as always, the photo reference and the gridded versions that I use to work from will be posted up on the members page. Like always, I drew this one out using a 2H pencil and a grid on a smooth gessoed canvas. Because there's so many subtle curves along the outside of the hand and the fingers, I decided to start this one with frisket film. When I'm painting, I like to simplify as much as I can. I don't like to get ahead of myself and make it more complicated than it needs to be. So the way that I'm going to approach this is just by painting one finger at a time. You can see I masked off the pinky here, and I'll just start on that. So for this whole painting, I'm going to work from the left side over to the right. The color mixture is the same flesh tone from the last painting tutorial, which is about 5 parts burnt umber, 8 parts sepia, and about 3 parts scarlet. That makes this a transparent color, and that's what I'll be using for this whole painting. So starting with the small finger on the left side, or the pinky, the first thing I'm doing here is just mapping in these lines around the fingernail. You can see that I just accidentally pulled too far back on the trigger and the airbrush spit, but notice where that paint sprayed. It sprayed on the shield itself, and this is very important. It's the same thing I'm doing here for the cuticle, spraying it on the shield. This way the overspray gets onto the canvas and gives you a very soft, subtle line. And some people have asked me what's the best shield to get, and the truth is it really doesn't matter. I will use any shield I have, basically whatever's closest to me at the time. And if you don't have any shields, you could just make your own using some pieces of paper and cut out some curves with an X-Acto blade. Those will work just as well as any shield you could buy. The only difference is they're not going to last that long. You'll have to make a new one every few months or so. Now for these small wrinkles and folds on the skin, especially around the knuckles, I'm using one of my favorite painting tools, and that again is just another piece of paper. But instead of a smooth curve cutting it, I just ripped the piece off. So a ripped piece of paper like this is going to have a subtle, kind of like a deckled edge on it. And then when I spray on that paper, let the overspray get onto the canvas, that texture is just going to transfer over. And just like all my other painting tutorials, you'll see that I'm using this all the time. It's just one of the best tools, and it's basically free. As I'm painting in these shadows for the creases on this skin, notice that I left the frisket film on. The reason for that is because some of these folds, some of these shadows roll around the side of the finger where we can't see it, so that would be off the canvas. And that frisket film is just going to make sure that all the paint stays on the finger itself. I could focus all of my attention on painting in these small shadows, not at all concerned with any overspray that may get onto the canvas where I don't want it. If you look at my completed painting on the left side of the screen, you'll notice that there's a small shadow in between each finger. So I want to start at the left here at the bottom of this little finger. I'm just going to line my shield up along with that piece of frisket on the right side, and then just spray over it, spraying that paint to the left. And since I want this one darker and a bit more defined, I'm spraying the paint here directly on the canvas, not on the shield like I was doing before. The next thing I want to do here is spray a thin glaze of this paint across the finger, just so I have some paint down so that I can get this frisket film off and see the painting clearer. But before I get to that, what I'm going to do here is switch over to my eraser and lighten up a few of these lines that I painted in before. When I painted in all those small shadows for the creases on the skin here, I made sure I did that on a blank canvas, and that was intentional. And the reason for that is because it's much more forgiving. I noticed that I painted in some of these a bit too dark here, so all I'm doing is going over them with my eraser, just lightly passing this over the top, removing a few thin layers of paint. The line is still going to stay here, but it's just going to get softer. If I had a thin glaze of paint over the top of these lines, they'd be much harder to erase into. And that's because if you erase into them with paint surrounding them, you're also going to remove some of that paint. So it's going to add some highlights where you don't want them, and it just makes it a bit more difficult. You can still do it, but if you want to make it more forgiving and easy on yourself, I'd always recommend adding some of your texture in before you add a glaze over the top. So at this point, this is good enough. I'm happy with where these lines are. So what I'll do here is go right back over to the airbrush with the same color in it and just glaze some paint over the top. Because this color is transparent, I'm going to control all my values, the darks and the lights, by how much paint I spray. I noticed in the reference that it's a bit darker on the right side of the finger, so I'm spraying a bit more paint there. And on the left side of it where it's lighter and there's some highlights, I'm spraying less. I'm also controlling my airbrush so that I direct the paint on this finger. I don't want to randomly spray paint all around this. When painting with Frisket film, it's important to remember that it's not like a stencil where you just spray over it and you get an image on the canvas. I can't just spray over the top of this entire Frisket film because I only cut out the part of the painting that I'm working on, which is that little finger. For example, on the lower right side of the screen here where I'm circling this, you can see that I just tore off a piece of the Frisket down here. If I sprayed paint over that, that texture is going to transfer right to the canvas, and obviously I don't want that. So I have to make sure that I'm focusing the paint onto the finger, spraying more on the right side of it where I see the shadow. So at this point, when I have enough paint on, I'm going to remove the Frisket. And this is very important because it's difficult to see the values and the color correctly when Frisket is on the painting. And I'll show you what I mean here. You'll see that as I remove the Frisket, suddenly this color looks much darker than it did before. We of course know that it's the exact same color and value. The only thing that changed is the background. This blue painter's tape is also not helping because that's a very different value than the white background. So I want to make sure that I remove that as I continue the painting so that I can see my values more accurately. I'll put up a screenshot here from a few seconds ago so you can see the difference with and without the Frisket. You can see that it's pretty drastic. We of course know that both of these values are exactly the same, but our eyes and our brains can really play some tricks on us. And this is why in all my videos, I'm always saying that I want to get the Frisket off as quickly as possible because I want to see those values accurately, the way I would see them in the final painting. Surrounding values also have a huge effect on the way that we perceive hues, which are the colors as well. And because this painting is basically monochromatic, meaning that it's one color, I'm not going to talk about that in this one, but it's something that I'll definitely get into in a future video. So now that those shadows are in and we have a base value down, which is going to act as the midtone, it's time to add in the highlights, which is done with an eraser. And now just for fun, because why not, see if you could decide where the light source is coming from if you look at my completed painting on the left side of the screen. Compared to the last two painting tutorials, which were the eye and the mouth, this one's a bit more difficult, but if you take a second or so, you should have no problem figuring it out. And the reason that I would say that this one is slightly more difficult is because the highlights and shadows are a bit more subdued. There's no specular highlights, there's no direct reflections of the light source. But if you pay attention to it, you'll notice that the highlights are on the right side and the shadows are just off to the left. That means the light source is above and to the right. And just like the last two painting tutorials, I'm thinking about that as I'm adding in these highlights. As I'm adding the highlights in on this pinky finger, they're always going to be to the right, and to the left is always going to be a shadow. Sometimes it's a bit stronger or darker, other times it's more subdued. And skin texture on the hand is filled with subtle changes in light and shadow. And those light and shadows are going to affect the way that this hand looks. It's going to add that 3D effect to it, and it's going to add that roundness. So as I'm painting in the highlights on this finger, you may notice that it seems to have a shadow on the opposite side. The shadow's on the right, and it looks like there's a bit of a highlight on the left. And that's because the finger to the right of it, which is the ring finger, is casting a shadow off to the left. So basically, most of this pinky finger is in a cast shadow. And the reason I know this is not because I took the photo reference or set it up. This is a stock image from Adobe Stock. The reason I know that is just because I'm observing it. I can see that. That's why observation is absolutely everything in painting. Now, in order to add these textures in, I'm just working on one part, scratching into the paint, and just using different amounts of pressure to see how much paint I can remove. This paint was applied pretty thin, so I don't need that much pressure to pull it out. I'll just go over an area a few times. If it's still too dark, I'll go over it another time to help lighten it more. The light that I'm seeing here on the knuckles is in between each one of these creases that we painted in before using that ripped piece of paper. So I'm just going to go in between each one of these, adding a highlight to the top. And even though this finger is in that cast shadow, a lot of times in a shadow, you will see some light. It's not that the light is directly hitting it from the light source. What it is reflected light. So another way to think of this is if this was your hand and you put it down, if you imagine a wall to the left of it and the light source is over to the right. So the right side is going to light it up and some of that light is going to bounce off the wall to the left. So a bit of the left side in the shadow is going to be illuminated. I hope that that made sense. A lot of times when you're painting, you'll see something in shadow and there's always just a bit of light kind of in there. That's reflected light. So I'm working my way down this finger, just adding highlights as I see that I need them. And what I'm doing here is I'm basically breaking this finger down into small parts, just like I did the whole painting. When I just started this one, I said that I'm going to focus on one finger at a time. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just focusing on the little finger. But now that I'm working on this finger, I'm thinking about it in small little chunks. I'm working from the top, working on one highlight, then working down to the next one. And to me, that's just one of the easiest ways to make a painting that's complicated a lot easier. Instead of thinking of it as one large painting, I just like to think of it as a bunch of small paintings that come together for a final one at the end. When I cut out a piece of frisket, like what I did for the small finger, is I like to save it. I usually just stick it on the wall right next to me. That way, if I need it again, it's right there. I can grab it and use it as needed. I wanted to darken up the right side of this finger because it still seemed a bit too light. So I had that piece of frisket film right next to me. I grabbed it and you can see here, I just lined up the right side of it. Then I could switch over to the airbrush, lightly spray on the paint where I need it, and the right side is going to be protected. So it's useful and it kind of speeds things up because you don't have to recut the frisket over and over. You don't have to go switching to shields to try to get each one to fit. At this point, everything is in on this finger. I have the highlights and the shadows where I want them. So now it's just a case of adding paint and removing it over and over to build up texture and build up the contrast. And while I'm doing this, I'm also adjusting some mistakes that I made. If anything seems a bit too bright or too dark, I could adjust it with my eraser or with the airbrush. For the time being, I'm going to call that first finger done. I'll definitely come back to it later to adjust it as needed, as I always do. But for now, I want to continue on moving along to the right to the next finger. Now this finger is the exact same technique as before. Add on frisket, cut out the outline, and then use shields or rip pieces of paper for some of the small shadows, and then thinly glaze the paint over the top. Once that's done, the frisket comes right off. This way I could see the values better, and I switch over to the eraser. On this finger, you can see that the light source is directly hitting it. We're getting a pretty bright highlight along the right side of it that goes straight down, and the left side still has a shadow, but it's kind of softer. It's not that pronounced. And all I'm doing here is just really paying attention to what I see in that reference. There's no secrets or tricks to this. I'm using it to learn from and see how light plays off this hand. If an area needs to be lighter, like this highlight on the right side of the finger, all I do is erase into it more. As I showed earlier, removing that frisket film changes the way that I see the painting. And the same thing happens here as I paint more and more of the painting. Now that the next finger is in, the ring finger is in, I'm seeing that the pinky finger looks too light. So I added that piece of frisket back on and darkened up the pinky finger. And this is the process that I usually do on every single painting. Once something new is painted in, I'll go back to other areas that I finished before and adjust them as needed. So now moving away from the fingers to the hand itself, the first thing I'm doing here is using some 3M vinyl tape, and I'm just masking off the left side. Vinyl tape is pretty amazing stuff. You can get it to fit on almost every curve as long as it's not too tight. This one had a bunch of subtle curves in it, so it worked very well. And then you could see that I just masked off the left side of it where I don't want paint with some normal blue painter's tape. What I'm doing here is just getting some paint down to darken this up. This is going to act as my mid-tone, so I have something to erase into to add those highlights in later. And just like frisket film, I want to get any sort of masking tape off as quickly as I can so that I could see the values a lot more accurately. For all the textures on the hand here, I'm going to be using a slightly different approach than what we did before. I'm going to start by adding in the highlights and then add the shadows later on. There's no particular reason why I'm doing this. I just want to show that you don't have to follow procedures where you have to do one step after another. You could really approach it any way you want. When I looked at the reference photo, I love to squint my eyes. That kind of makes the image blurry. And when I do that, I can just see those large values of light and dark. So when I did that, I saw that some of the brightest areas on the left side of this hand here were some of these veins that are kind of popping through the skin, and a bit of this left side of the hand that's kind of rolling away where some reflected light is hitting it. And I don't want to get lost or lose my place, so I'm not going to go too far with these highlights. I'm just going to get a few in on the upper left-hand side of this hand, and then from here, I'll switch over to my airbrush and start adding in the corresponding shadows. I'll use my shield and I will start up in this corner in between the two fingers where that right finger is casting a shadow over to the left. Just spray that in and then work my way down, adding shadows to the left of these highlights. Now, as I'm painting in these shadows, I don't need to use a shield for every one. I'm only going to use the shield for the ones that have sharp edges. Like this one off to the right in between the veins, it just looks a bit softer to me, so I'll do that freehand. As I continue to paint this, I want to talk about some basic anatomy, some of the bones and the structure underneath the hand, just so you can see what's going on here. When a hand is held out and extended like this, you're going to see a ton of textures which show up through the skin. And if you look at my completed painting on the left, it's obvious there are a bunch of veins that are protruding through. And also there are these lines starting from the bottom going right up to each one of the fingers or the digits. These thin strands here that look like bones are actually sitting on top of the bones, and those are tendons called extensor tendons. And these tendons are usually seen in a pretty straight line. They go up right from the base of the hand, from the wrist, all the way up over the knuckles into the fingers. And then underneath that, you have the bone structure, which I'm putting a little overlay in. This isn't lined up perfectly, but it'll help give you an idea of what's going on. In the hand itself, you'll have the metacarpal bones, which are these long ones right here. You have 4 on the left side and then 1 going up on the right for the thumb. And these metacarpal bones, of course, connect to the fingers itself, which are called the phalanges. And you can see in each one of the fingers or digits, there are 3 separate bones: the proximal, the middle, and the distal. And you definitely don't need to know the bone structure if you're drawing or painting, but sometimes it's nice to just understand that in each finger there are 3 bones, and then underneath the hand, where the palm of the hand is, there's going to be 1 more going down to the base of the wrist. And then of course, besides the bones and the tendons that I just talked about are of course all the muscles underneath the hand, but I'd be lying to you if I said that I remembered all the names of the muscles. There's just no way. That was a long time ago. But if you're curious and you want to learn more about the structural anatomy underneath the skin of the hand, there's plenty of great things here on YouTube, really great medical lectures, and it's all really just a Google search away. So moving along to the next 2 fingers, I placed on Frisket film just like I did before and sprayed a thin glaze. But this time you can see that I'm doing it a little bit differently. I applied the glaze first, and then I'm coming in with the shields and the rip paper to add in some of those shadows. And there's no particular reason of why I'm doing this. I just want to show you here that you don't have to follow a procedure step by step. You can approach this any way you'd like, and that's very, very important to remember. So this is where I'm going to wrap up the first part of this. I have another tutorial coming up in a week or so where I'm going to focus just on painting skin texture. And in that one, I'm just going to go into a lot more depth on the ways that I like to paint skin texture. And then we'll continue the rest of this painting, just the bottom part of the hand, by using those techniques, the ones that I go over in depth, by applying them to this painting. So I hope that's cool with everyone. We'll come back to this in a week or so, and we'll continue it then. I just want to take the last minute or so to say thank you so much to all of you who help support this channel. First of all, I want to welcome the newest members, Bruce at a very generous tier 3. Thank you so much for joining and welcome. I'd also like to welcome the 2 newest members this week, John and Serge. Thank you guys so much. And also thank you so much to you, Ryland, for the $20 super thanks from last week's video. That was totally unexpected, very generous of you. So thank you so much. And of course, I want to thank the kind and incredible support from the long-term channel members, starting with these 3 guys who've been members for 16 months. That's Andrew, M. Shibley, and Dwayne. All 3 of you guys, thank you so much. And of course, thank you to all the current members, Ken and Pete, both at 12 months. Carl, Michael, Mere Creative, and Mackie Mark at 10 months. And thank you to Leon, Adam, John, Robin, Rick, William, Peter, Hector, Fernando, Svavar, Joshua, Adrian, Israel, Erland, Tony, Herbert, Donovich, Thomas, Phil, Mark, Grant, M. Webb, Mike, NH, Airbrush Art and Customs, Tony, Lee, Charles, Thaga, Vinny, Mike C, PSI, Ari, and of course, Bruce, John, and Serge. So thank you guys all so much for your incredible and kind support. I'll see you back here next Friday.